let's work this image. We are back to all of the defaults from shot in camera. So the first thing I need to do is just look at the image and figure out what I want to do. Well, I'm guessing there's more shadow detail in here. I think I need to brighten it up. It's looking a little dingy. So let's go about this and get it looking good. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my white balance tool from up in the toolbar here, and I'm going to come down onto the image and click on things that are gray or white. Basically, I'm looking for something that I know is neutral. So when I click on the road, it warms it up a little bit too much for my taste. Let's click on a shirt. It's a little bit cooler. That's looking pretty good. If I hit P, it's kind of showing me a before and after. Now, do you notice how my image is actually changing when I do that? So the reason for that is when I come over here to my tabs, there's a lens correction tab, and this is already being applied automatically to the image. So it's straightening and correcting for variances in different lenses. So it's taking care of chromatic aberrations, and it's enabling a profile correction for this Sony lens. So back to the basics tab. So that's why you're seeing that big change there. I think that's looking pretty good. It's a little bit warm. It's a nice morning light, but it's not too warm. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and look at my exposure, contrast, highlight, all of these things. While I'm looking at that, I'm going to take a look at my histogram to see how things are looking. So basically, things are pretty spread out nicely. I've got blacks and I've got whites. So if I push the black slider, I can lose detail. So I want to be careful with that. If I double click on any slider, it takes it back to 0. But notice when I start to push it a little bit up in the histogram, it goes from black. This little arrow right here goes from black to blue, and as I keep pushing it to white. So as it's doing that, it's giving me a warning that I might be losing detail in my shadows. That's your call. Do you need all of that shadow detail? A lot of times you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes things are just black. So if you want to make more impact, you can do that. I'm going to pull it back though to about there. Same thing with the white slider. I can push that to the right, and you can see it goes from black to a little red, to a little yellow. So it's brightening all of my whites. So you can see what it's doing. Now, if I push that too far, I'm going to be blowing out my whites, which means there's going to be no information there. And that is bad, because if there's no information and your whites are an RGB value of 255, 255, 255, that means no ink is going to lay down on the paper and your print quality is going to suffer. So you don't want to push that too extreme. So I'm going to pull that back as well. So I've made a little bit of adjustment here. Shadows. If I push it to the right, the shadow slider, it gives me shadow detail. Ooh, I'm liking that better already. So I'm up at plus 64. If I push it this way, I lose shadow detail, and this way being left. So I'm going to push it up here and give myself some shadow detail. Highlights. If I push my highlights to the left, it's going to bring in highlight detail. Okay, so that's looking a little muddy now that I've done that. So I'm going to pull it back. We don't want to go that far. But that's a really good tool for if your clouds are kind of blown out or you're looking to bring out more white detail. Next up, we've got contrast. A lot of times, I don't need to do a lot with my contrast if my white, blacks, and shadows and highlights are dialed in. But going to the right gives you more contrast. To the left gives you less contrast. Once again, if you double click, it takes you back to 0. So I'll give it a little tick. We also have exposure controls. We can push the exposures by 5 stops in either direction. Remember, ideally you want to be dialed in, but making a slight adjustment never hurts anything. So I'm a plus 0.3. So blacks are your blackest blacks. Whites are your whitest whites. Shadows, those are your midtone blacks. Highlights, those are your midtone whites. Contrast, it's how quickly you go from black to white, and by going right, it gives you more contrast. By going left, it gives you less contrast. Occasionally, I take it to the left, but most of the time, it would be going right, but not by too much if you have a good exposure. And then your exposure, 0.3 for me on this particular image. These settings are going to change with every single image that you work on. So that's the start. Next up, we come down to here, and we've got texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Let's look at what those do.